Chapter 5 of the Story of Ancient Irish Civilization. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Schneider. The Story of Ancient Irish Civilization by P.W. Joyce. Chapter 5 How the Irish People Lived as Christians. It is not our business here to tell how the Irish were converted to Christianity, for this has been already related in our histories of Ireland. Whether St. Patrick was born in Gaul or in Scotland, we know at any rate that he brought with him to Ireland, to aid him in his great work, a number of young Gauls and Britons whom he had ordained as priests. But soon after his arrival he began to ordain natives also, whom he had converted, so that the work of traveling through the country and preaching to the people was for some time in the beginning done by foreigners and Irishmen. But as time went on, the missionaries were chiefly native born. St. Patrick loved the Irish people, and he was continually praying that God would bestow favors on them. And his prayers were answered. For after the apostolic times, there never were more devoted or more successful missionaries than those who preached the gospel in Ireland. And there never were people who received the faith more readily than the Irish, or who practiced it after their conversion with more piety and earnestness. An old Irish writer who lived about 1200 years ago tells us that the saints of Ireland who lived and worked and died before this time were of three orders. The first order of Catholic saints, says this writer, were most holy, shining like the sun. They were 350 in number, all bishops, beginning with St. Patrick. For more than 30 years they were led by their great master with all his fiery and tireless energy, and the preachers of this order continued for a little more than a century. They devoted themselves entirely to the home mission, the conversion of the Irish people, which gave them quite enough to do. The second order was of Catholic priests, continues the old writer, numbering 300, of whom a few were bishops. These were very holy, and they shone like the moon. They lasted for a little more than half a century. The priests of the second order were chiefly monastic clergy, that is to say, monks, and during their continuance monasteries were founded everywhere throughout Ireland. Though there were monks and monasteries here from the time of St. Patrick, they began to spread much more rapidly after the foundation of the great monastery of Clonmel in Meath by St. Finan or Finian, one of the second order of saints, about the year 527. It was the monks belonging to this order and their successors who preached the gospel in foreign lands with such amazing success, as will be told in chapter 7. The monks and students of these establishments led a busy and happy life, for it was a rule that there should be no idleness. Everyone was to be engaged at all available times in some useful work. Some tilled the land around belonging to the monastery, plowing, digging, sowing, reaping, and attending to the cattle. Some worked as carpenters, tailors, smiths, shoemakers, cooks, and so forth, for the use of the community. Some were set apart to receive and attend to travelers and guests who were continually coming and going, to wash their feet and prepare supper and bed for them. Many were employed as scribes to copy and ornament manuscript books, while others made beautiful closiers, brooches, chalices, crosses, and other works of metallic art, and the most scholarly members were selected to teach in the schools. Besides this, all had their devotions to attend to, which were frequent and often long. The third order of Irish saints consisted of about 100 priests, of whom a few were bishops. These were holy and shone like the stars, and they lasted a little more than 3/4 of a century. They were all hermits, living either singly or in monasteries in remote, lonely places. Even when they lived together in numbers, they were still hermits, spending their time in prayer and contemplation, each in his own little cell, and they never met together or had any communication with each other, except at stated times, when all assembled in the little church for common worship or in the refectory for meals. We know that there were nuns and convents in Ireland from St. Patrick's time, but they increased and multiplied and flourished more than ever during and after the time of the greatest nun of all, St. Bridget of Kildare. In the time of St. Patrick and for long afterwards, the churches were small, because the congregations were small, and they were mostly of wood, though some were of stone. We have, in fact, the ruins of little stone and mortar churches still remaining in many parts of the country, built at various times during the 4 or 5 centuries after St. Patrick. In the 11th and following centuries, however, large and grand churches were built, the ruins of which still remain all over the country. Near many of the monasteries, the monks began to erect tall, round towers in the beginning of the 9th century as a protection against the Danes. They were built with several stories, each story lighted by one little window and reached by a ladder inside. The door was small and was usually 10 or 12 feet from the ground. The moment word was brought that a party of Danish marauders were approaching, the monks would refuge in the tower with all their valuables and a good supply of large stones, and barred the door and windows strongly on the inside, so that it was impossible to get at them during the short time the robbers were able to stay. In fact, the Danes were generally afraid of their lives to approach too close to these towers, for if one of them ventured near enough, a big stone, dropped by one of the monks from a height of 60 or 70 feet, was likely enough to come down right on his skull and make short work of him. We have still remaining many of these old towers. There was a spring well beside every monastery, either that or a stream of pure water. The founder never selected a site till he had first ascertained that a well or a stream was near. These fountains served the double purpose of baptizing converts and of supplying the communities with water. In most cases, they were named after the founders and retain their names to this day. It has been already stated that the early missionaries often took over the wells the pagans had worshipped as gods and devoted them to Christian uses. We have holy wells in every part of Ireland, and it is with good reason we call them so, for they preserve the memory, and in most cases the very names, of those noble old missionaries who used the crystal waters to baptize their converts. We ought to make it a point, so far as lies in our power, to take care of these holy wells, and to keep them neat and clean, and in all respects in a becoming condition, and also to preserve their old names as our fathers handed them down to us. If there could be such a thing as grief in heaven, an old Irish missionary would certainly feel grieved to look down on the little well he loved and used and blessed, now lying unnoticed and neglected. St. Patrick used consecrated bells in celebrating the divine mysteries and in nearly all other religious ceremonies, and the custom has descended through 15 centuries to this day. The bells used by the early saints were small hand bells made of iron dipped in melted bronze, but 300 or 400 years after St. Patrick's time, people began to make them of a better material, bronze melted and cast in molds. We are told that St. Patrick left a little iron bell in every church he founded, and to supply the great number he required for this purpose, he kept in his household 3 smiths, whose sole business from morning till night was to make iron bells. The very bell he himself used in his ministrations, commonly called the Bell of the Will, may now be seen in the National Museum in Dublin, the most venerable of all early Christian relics. Beside it, in the same glass case, stands a beautiful and costly shrine made by an accomplished Irish artist in the year 1100 to cover and protect it, by order and expense of Donald O'Loughlin, King of Ireland. It was usual for the founders of churches to plant trees round the buildings. These sacred groves, as they were called, were subsequently held in great veneration, and it was regarded as a desecration to cut down one of the trees or even to lop off a branch. End of chapter 5.